Hello, welcome to Lab 1A. This is going to give you a brief introduction of 3ds Max and give you a feel for how its interface works. So the first thing you're going to probably, if you're new to 3ds Max, you might be overwhelmed because there's a lot of things going on here. Don't worry, I don't even know half of them. Well, I know most of them, but don't be overwhelmed about all of this yet. We're going to introduce things one step at a time, and hopefully you shouldn't be overwhelmed. But firstly, what we're going to go over is these topics. We're just going to go through one by one. I've also got down here, you'll see that when I click and do things, it will come up here telling you what I'm doing. You might wonder, wait, what did he press? But it'll be down on the bottom left here. That's one thing to note with these video tutorials. But anyway, let's get to it. So, viewport navigation. What we have in 3ds Max are these four windows here. These are called viewports. These are basically our kind of 3D windows into what's going on in the scene. By standard, we have 1, 2, 3, 4. So we've got a top view, a front view, a left view, and a perspective view. One thing also to understand with 3D is we have perspective and orthographic. Perspective means that we have depth. So if I just make a box here, don't worry about this. If I make a box here, you can see in each of these, they just look like squares. That's because we have no depth in any of these images. The front here with no depth, the top here with no depth, the left view here with no depth. In this perspective one, we have depth, so we get a proper 3D look and feel. Also, by the way, if your workspace doesn't look like this when you start, up here, we have our workspace. You can reset to default state. That will just get it looking exactly like my one right now. Viewport navigation. One other thing I like to do is I don't actually like this for space layout. I never use it. What I like this one here. So if you click here, down on this little arrow hiding over here, this will let you choose your kind of default square space. This is the one I like to use, just here. I'll probably always be using this one, so if you want to follow along with me exactly the same, I'd select this one here. It does make a difference to how things are going to be done. It's just preference, really. Okay, so with this up here, you might notice I've been clicking around. If I middle click, I can kind of just pan around. But I'm going to make this one a perspective. I like my main big window to be a perspective viewport. So over here, I can just click up here and then change to perspective. The other way you can do that is just by a hotkey, which you should kind of get used to hotkeys in the program because you'll become much quicker and more efficient. But if I press P, we'll switch to perspective mode. And I'm going to come out of wireframe to default shading, which is just kind of going to show us all our faces. So we've switched to perspective and we've switched to default shading up here. Now, what I can do is I can middle click and still pan around, but if I hold Alt and middle click, then I can rotate. So if you have 3ds Max open, just kind of get a feel for moving and looking around the viewport. So middle click to pan, hold Alt and middle click, and that will rotate around your object. And another one is to zoom in and out, which is just a scroll wheel. That's kind of the main way to navigate and look around your objects. If you're not familiar with this, just kind of play around for a while and make a box. So over here, just click the plus key, click a box, and just draw one out like that. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but just so you've got something to look around with. Play around with that for a little bit until you feel comfortable that you can move and navigate. If you hit Z, it will focus on the object you have. If you've clicked onto here already and don't want to make another box, you just want to click on something else, you can hit W and that will just get rid of that there. W just resets to the move mode, but again, we'll talk about that in a little bit of a sec. So if I click on this one, hit Z, then it'll focus on there. If I click that one, hit Z, it'll focus on there. That's just kind of the basic standard navigation. Again, as I say, play around with it a bit just so you get used to it. This is a big kind of aspect of 3D modeling, is to be able to manipulate your viewports and get a feel and look around with them. Next thing we're going to do is set up autosave. One beautiful thing with 3ds Max is it likes to crash. It's kind of notorious for crashing, but we can at least increase our autosave number so we've got more backups. So if you go over to File up here, go to Preferences, and scene level undo, we're going to increase that as well. So it just means we've got more undos to work with. I'm going to put it about 100. You can put it higher. Max is 500. I'm going to leave it at 100, but it'd be good for you to leave it at 500 right now. Okay, and to increase the autosaves, if we go to Files here, auto backup is enabled, which is great. Our number of autoback files is 3. Let's increase that to 10 for just now. I'm going to increase it to 10. Go as high as you can when you're starting off, it's good. But one thing to note is when your 3ds Max files start getting bigger, it saves a different version every time, so it can start clogging up your hard drive. 10 is good for me. Maybe starting off, put it about 20. It doesn't matter, it's just the amount of backup files it's going to make. And you can see here it's going to do that every 5 minutes. Once it gets to 10, it just goes back over the first one. So whatever number you have there, if I only had 3, once it got to the third one, it would just, in that 5 minutes, it would go back to the first one. So we want quite a high-ish number, just to be safe there. 5 minutes is good. Don't want to go any longer than that. If it crashes, we can go back to 5 minutes all the time. Just hit OK there. One other thing whilst we're setting up our 3ds Max, we need to make sure our units are all correct. So if you go to Customize up here and go to Unit Setup, so just up here, Customize Unit Setup, we want to use meters. I don't know about you, but I understand meters. Meters works for me. So you could change it to centimeters, kilometers, blah, blah, blah. That's kind of all silly. I'd suggest everyone just go by meters for just now. It's nice and easy. So just click OK there. So we've done viewport navigation, we've set up our autosaves. Now I'm going to talk about creating primitives. Primitives are our standard geometry that we can create and start working from. Over here, on this plus tab, we've got our standard primitives. Down here, we've got our different ones we can make. So if I hit box here, that will come up with all of these options here. So if I just start clicking, this is me defining the width and length. So I can just go like that, let go of the click, and then it lets me go up and down to do the height. So I could just go there. And that's us made a box. Nice and simple. Over here, we can define its parameters. So its length, we could say maybe it's 3 meters by 2 meters by 0.5 meters. Don't worry about these settings right now. We're not doing anything special. I'm just kind of going over everything. And there we go. Yeah, we've made a box. We could also give it segments. So these segments here just kind of give us more geometry to work with. And geometry being points, edges, and polygons. And you can see that we just get more kind of polygons to work with. That's kind of the standard way to make our primitives. So that's just a box. Play around with these. So just right now to play, like maybe I'll take a plane. Over here you get a sphere. Just play around with them, see what the values do. To move them, press W, that'll bring up your movement. Then move your objects. So you can see here with this axis, we'll talk about that in a sec, but just now, quickly play around, bring in some of these. There's our teapot. Okay, viewport shading. We kind of touched on it a second ago. Our shading is just what we call the term for how our viewports show our objects. Right now we've just got default. That just means it's going to show every polygon without any edges, and kind of gives us an overall look and feel. We can change that, so if you flick through these, you'll see what they kind of do. So facets or facets, it's one word I've never said out loud. That just kind of shows it so we can see each polygon without any blending. So on this object here with the sphere, you can see the difference between default shading and facets. Default just kind of smooths out the polygons, but facets means we can see them. I rarely use that shading type. You don't need to worry about that one too much. The main one we would be using is wireframe. Sometimes you might want to see the wireframes, but I just keep it on default, and what I do is I press F4. F4 lets you switch between seeing the edges. That's something I'll be using a lot, so just know that if you press F4, we can see the edges and polygons. So that's a good one. I'm going to even keep it on for just now. Over here, we have high quality, standard, performance, and DX mode. You don't need to worry about that too much at the moment. With Arnold, which is a render engine we'll be talking about later, it kind of doesn't work with the shading the lights in the viewport, so don't worry about that just now. We'll just keep it standard. So again, if you find yourself stuck on something, just press W and it will come out of it. With each of these objects, hopefully you've created a few objects. If you haven't, just again go to here, standard primitives, and make some objects. When we click on them, we can actually change their initial parameters that we started with, and we can do that here. This is our kind of edit tab. And then we can see our teapot here, and then we got our parameters down here. So I can untick these parts, and these are the options that it gives me. Increase the segments. Don't go too high with that because it might crash. And we can change the radius. So things like spheres, we can change our radius of our sphere and the amount of segments. So if we wanted a bit more detailed, we could maybe say 64. And this hemisphere just lets us kind of cap it off, so we can make a dome And each of these objects, just play around with them and get a feel for the different parameters that you can play around with. Okay, now you might have seen here when we get an object, any object, and I hit W for move. No, that's not intuitive, but W is move. We get our axes up here. So I talked about this in the lecture. This is our X, Y, and Z axis. X is always red, Y is always green, and Z is always blue. And what we have here is what we call our gizmo. Our gizmo is basically this little thing here, and you can see when I hover over different bits, it comes up yellow. That's going to let us move in just that plane or axis. So if I hover over Z here, you can see that it goes yellow, and that will let me move. No matter where I move the mouse, it's going to be locked to going up and down on that axis. Same goes for Y and X. So that just lets us move only one axis. Now you'll notice here we've got these ones here as well. That will let us move in the plane of both those axes. So down here, X and Y, that'll let us just slide it along that plane. Over here, slide along that plane, and here, slide along the X and Z plane. So that's handy and useful. Sometimes you want to keep things locked, and that's how we do it. And if you want to move it in all of them, you can just click in the middle. Although I generally don't recommend moving in all three axes because we have a 2D screen and it kind of gets confusing. It's always best just to move in one or two at a time. It keeps things much easier to understand. That's our move tool anyway, with W. So if I hit E, it brings up the rotate tool. Rotate, you can see, brings up a different kind of gizmo. This is our rotate gizmo, but it's the same. Our X axis is the red one, Y is the green one, and Z is the blue one. And play around what happens when you rotate, how to rotate in just one axis. So it's kind of pretty intuitive. It gives you a feel for it. So blue, Z, can rotate that way, and then red, X, I can rotate that way. Green, Y, rotate that way. Yeah, then we can rotate things. So maybe I want that like that and like that for no reason. Then I can press W and move it. So what I want you to do now is just play around with moving things and rotating them, and I don't know, maybe make a funny little scene moving things around. Doesn't really matter right now, but just get a feel for that. And the other aspect is scale. If we press R, we'll get scale, and that will let us make things bigger and smaller. And again, we can do it by just two axes. So if I wanted this donut to just kind of be wider along the ground plane, I could just do that like that, and you see it kind of gets squashed, but that's what happens when we just scale in two axes. So you could, with this box for example, stretch it out like that along the Y axis. You can kind of change its parameters like that. We generally don't want to scale objects like that, just it causes problems later, but just know that you can quickly make things bigger and smaller like that. So again, just play around, move things around, and get a feel for it. So you see here we've got this little grid, and we've got grids here. What we can do is snap to those grids. So I'm just going to delete this ground plane here that I made, and I'm going to select this box here. If I press S, that brings up our snapping, and you'll see that I kind of got this cursor locked to this grid points, and that means if I move this, it's kind of snapping to those points. So this is very useful sometimes when we're making things very precise and accurate and we want to know exactly where they should be. Just know that pressing S brings up your snapping and we can move it to the right place. So when I press S on and off, you'll see this icon up here, which is our snap icon, go on and off so you know when it's on. If I right click it, it comes up with these other options. These can be pretty handy later. We'll probably go into some of them, but it just lets us snap to different things. So I could snap an object to a vertex of another object or a face of another object. They're quite handy. We'll probably go into them at some point later. And another snap that we might want to have is rotation. I rarely ever want my objects to rotate at such a free angle. It just means that if I rotate this just a tiny bit like that, so we see the value there is like 20.61. If I went and did other things and then came back to here and just wanted to quickly get it to align back with the scene, I would have to remember the value, and I can't remember the value. So what we can do instead is turn our rotate angle on. So up here, we can press A on and off, or just select it up here. That will just lock it to 5-degree increments. You see there, instead of it being an awkward float value, we've just got a nice steady 5 degrees every time. I usually have that turned on all the time. It's just much easier to rotate by 5-degree increments. It keeps everything nice and tidy. Okay, so we've gone through creating primitives, our viewport shading, edit primitive parameters, our axes, we talked about our X, Y, and Z, we've done move, we've done rotate, we've scaled. I've introduced you to snapping, the moving and rotation, so we're going to talk about hierarchies and instancing now. I'm just going to delete everything here and make this a bit clearer. One other little tip here, you've got these values down here, X, Y, and Z, so if I've got our move tool on, you can see them changing here. And these are our global ones right here. So if I select this object, I can just go down here and actually hit 0, tab, 0, tab, 0, and that will center this object on 0, 0, 0. Its coordinates are now just 0, 0, 0, which is nice and tidy. If I had an object that maybe just looked like, so I'm just editing the parameters, maybe it looked like 1, 1, and 3 here. Say this was an arm, and this maybe is the first part of our arm where the bicep is. If I wanted another object up here, that's how to copy things in 3ds Max. Control-C, Control-V doesn't work. What we want to do is select the object, hold Shift, and then drag and click, and that will make another object. Right now, just leave that a copy. So this would be the other part of the arm, and then this might be a hand. So drag and click, leave it a copy. Maybe I'll just make it a tiny bit fatter, just so I know that's a hand. And maybe that's 0.5. You can kind of just follow along, don't worry too much about this at the moment, just kind of watch it. Okay, so say this was a hand, forearm, and the top of the arm. We would want the hand to be a child of the forearm and the forearm to be a child of the upper arm. And the way we do that in 3ds Max is this tool up here, which is our select and link. And the way it works, if we click it, we click from the lowest one all the way to the highest one. With this selected, if I click on this hand, drag and click down to here, like that, and then this one, drag and click to there. Now you can see up here, we've got our hierarchy. Box 3, this one up here, is a child of box 2, which is a child of box 1. What will happen if I rotate box 1, you can see it rotates all of them. But if I rotate just box 2, you can see it's just rotating box 2 and box 3 because box 3 is a child of box 2. That's kind of the overview of hierarchies. Just know that whatever you do to the parent, it will do it to all children. That comes in handy for animation, which we'll do next year, but it's also pretty handy for keeping our scenes tidy. For example, if we had a house and everything inside the house, we might want everything inside the house to be a child of the house object, so that if we move the house, everything inside it's going to move with it. And then maybe we had a bed, we would want the bed to be a parent of maybe pillows and a duvet, so that when we move the bed it would move all those things. We'll be doing that in all of our scenes. We'll be making sure our scenes are nice and tidy. I'm just going to delete them. Okay, so we just talked about hierarchies. The only other thing we need to talk about now is instancing. Instancing will let us make a copy of the object but keep it linked to the original. So if I was to make a cylinder like this, and I wanted lots of these cylinders, but I wanted them to be the same. If I hold Shift and click to make a copy, then we get this option up here, clone options. What I'm going to do now is click here to instance, and you'll see what will happen. These two are instance of each other now. So if I edit the parameters of this one here, you can see that it changes the other one. So this is very handy when we want to make lots of objects that should be the same. So like lights or chairs, something in a scene that there's more than one of. It means that when we want to go back and change it, it will happen to the other. So very handy. And you can see what would happen if I clicked and did it but didn't make it. If that was a copy, then you see these two are instance, so they're affecting each other. And it doesn't matter which one I click, it doesn't need to be the original, but they will stay linked to each other. If I wanted to break the instance, there's this button here which makes unique. If I did that, now it's unique. It won't be instanced to this anymore. But I could undo and go back. Woo. Undo and go back to where it is. Okay, that's our overview of 3ds Max. If you have any questions, more questions, just shout on me. I'll come over. If you're doing this at home and you still got any questions, just fire me an email, and I'll see you in the next one.